Stay hungry, stay foolish.
So now on the Innovation Show, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Jeff Kreisler, co-author of the awesome Dollars and Cents with Dan Ariely. Jeff, I'm going to let you give your own introduction because you have such a great background, a polymath in the true sense of a polymath, and it's something we celebrate on this show the whole time. So if you wouldn't mind, before we go into the background of the book and the themes you touch on, it'd be great to get a bit of a background on you, Jeff.
Sure. Well, I love the term polymath. It sounds like a mathematician who has sex with other mathematicians, but also other scientists and anyone in the field of study. I have a atypical background. Maybe for your polymath fans, it's familiar. I went to some good schools here in the States, including Princeton and Virginia Law School, University of Virginia Law School, Thomas Jefferson School. And I was sort of on that track. And then I took a detour and I became a stand-up comedian. And I focused on political comedy. I won the Bill Hicks Spirit Award, which I bet a lot of your listeners know Bill Hicks. It was a lot to live up to. And I journeyed down that road for a while. Then I got interest from someone to say, hey, do you want to write a humor column about business and finance? And I said no. And then they said, it will pay. And I said yes. So I learned about business and finance. I had a degree in economics from Princeton, so I sort of knew what I was talking about a little bit. From the column, then I got an opportunity. Someone approached me to see if I wanted to write a book. That turned into my first book, which is called Get Rich Cheating, which was a satire of everything that's gone wrong in the world. America's current president was well represented in that book that came out in 2009. It was about steroid use and about political cheating and business cheating and Hollywood, and it was a lot of fun to write. My co-author, Dan Ariely, who wrote the book Predictably Irrational and teaches business at Duke University here in the States, he got a copy of my book, invited me to come down and lecture to his class. And my lectures at the time were sort of satirical. It was, tongue in cheek. I was basically pro-cheating to make a point about ethics and morality. And he would introduce me, and he wouldn't say, here's a comedian. He wouldn't say, here's something funny and not true. He'd just say, this guy has unique wealth building ideas. And I would go and I'd, say, cost-benefit analysis. There's no cost to get to cheating, right? No one is ever caught. One guy, Bernie Madoff. Everyone else gets off. And you make millions. And I would advocate for this and talk about how you could do it. And inevitably, someone would stop me about 20 minutes in and say, are you full of crap? And I would put it to the class. And, these Duke business students, and Duke is, a top 10 business school here, probably about a third to a half of them would sort of agree, be like, yeah, you make a good point. And that was fascinating to me to sort of see my intuition confirmed that even the smartest among us, the most highly trained, something about money messes with our heads. And in that case, it makes us consider unethical or immoral actions. And then there's so many more things it does. And Dan, being sort of a brilliant leader in the field of behavioral economics and behavioral science, we worked together on a few projects. He at one point said, you want to write this book? And it was about the psychology of money, basically, and what became Dollars and Cents. And we took it on. I learned so much about the field. I kind of gave myself a crash master's degree. And it just really opened my eyes to how money does mess with our head, how these human biases, how our human nature is so at play, how our emotions are so at play, even in the most sort of rational decisions about money and numbers. And of course, it plays out beyond money. But here we are. So we wrote the book, and now I'm at a stage where I sort of am hoping to evangelicalize a little about the lessons that I learned and that we share in the book.
The polymath thing is really interesting to me, and your background, and really interesting that the Duke students really got it and that Dan got it, because you have a different lens to look at this, and everybody in the world is taught through the same lens usually, and they all end up making the same decisions, thinking the same, lacking critical thinking, while you come and your comedian and your TV work and your writing all add a different lens. And I think that's what makes this so unique. And I think that's what your real skill has come across. Certainly to me, you demystify so many of the biases and so many of the myths and so many of the things that we are blind to, that you make them so clear to us. And you do that through humor. But what I found really interesting was everybody's talking about cryptocurrencies, digital currencies, Bitcoin, etc., etc. but nobody's looking at the real psychology behind money, and you've done that brilliantly here, and you've framed this really well in the book. Money is the top reason for divorce, number one cause of stress in Americans, and I would wager worldwide. People are worse at all kinds of problem solving when they have money problems in their mind. I'd love, Jeff, if you would tell us a little bit about some of the biases that we suffer from. For example, one of the biggest ones you talk about is opportunity cost.
Well, first, thank you for saying we did a good job of making it relatable. I think that's why Dan wanted to work with me, and whether it's uses of humor or storytelling, I have found throughout my career that topics that people find complex, whether it's been politics or it's business or money or topics that are stressful in the same way, using stories and humor and just to help people relate to it is an effective way to get them to understand. So I appreciate that came across. That was our intention. As far as opportunity costs, opportunity costs essentially are the costs that come when we do make a spending decision, right? It's everything else that we could spend our money on. A lot of financial literacy courses, they talk about like buying your $5 latte every day. Like, don't buy $5 coffee. You know what? Don't worry about the $5 coffee. But as an example, since that's a common one, the question of opportunity cost is what else could you spend that $5 on now and any time in the future? I mean, the beautiful thing about money is that it is fungible and it is divisible and it can be used for anything at any time, right? That $5 now can, instead of being a coffee, it could be, 5 packs of gum. It could be a little drip in the bucket of your retirement savings. It could be lottery tickets. It can be absolutely anything. And that's what's amazing about money, and allowed money to really change the way that society evolves, because we wouldn't be able to save if we didn't have money and just had to like store things. We'd just be bartering. But the fact that you can think about anything and use money for anything is really what the challenge is. Because as much as we should think about opportunity costs, we should think about everything else we can spend that money on. That's just really overwhelming, right? That's unrealistic to sit with every financial decision, big and small, and wonder, oh, what else could I do with this? It's crippling. So given that isn't what we do, right? We don't think about opportunity costs. And our hope in the book and in the talks I give and in all the work that Dan does and everything else is to get us a little closer to thinking about opportunity costs, or at least to recognize these biases, these things that take us away from opportunity costs. And it's really been amazing to me to see how little we do think about opportunity costs, even when we should. Dan did an experiment where he went to a car dealership and he asked people who are about to spend $30,000 on a Toyota, what else could you spend $30,000 on? And they couldn't come up with an answer, right? By all means, they should have said, oh, that would be, 3 really nice vacations, or it would be, more of a down payment on a house, or it would be half a year less working when I approach retirement, something like that. They couldn't come up with anything. And when pressed, the most they could do is say, well, if I didn't spend this money on a Toyota, I could spend it on a Honda. So they weren't really thinking about all the opportunity costs. Sorry about that ring.
No worries, man. Do you want to get it?
No, it's my fax machine.
Okay,
I still
cool.
have a fax machine because I'm 300 years old. Anyway, so so at the dealership, they weren't thinking about the opportunity costs, and we weren't thinking about the opportunity costs. And really, the opportunity costs are how you should think about money. But then we have all of these biases, things like sale prices and special deals, and our own sort of preconceived notions, and all the things that we go on and cover in the book that take us away, that lead us astray from finding what that real opportunity costs. And ultimately, opportunity cost is what we commonly call value, right? The value of a purchase is really like deciding, is it worth giving up all these other things it could be to get this now? And that's what we should figure out, but that's not what we do, because it's hard to do and because we have these outside signals that don't let us get to it.
One of the things you talk about related to opportunity cost is relativity. So we always frame the cost of something based on the price. So you talk about that with the car, for example. You might get an upgrade, you might get leather seats and stuff like that. It'd be great to let our audience know a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, the challenge with money and valuing things is that really, like, how do we have any sense of what something should be worth? Like, how do we know what a cup of coffee is worth, or how do we know what a house is worth? How do you put a monetary figure on in a vacuum? Right? The truth is we can't possibly figure that out. So what we end up doing is we end up comparing that price to other prices. Typically, what we maybe have paid for a house or a Coke in the past, or in the case of relativity, we create categories like there is the Coca-Cola now and there's a Coca-Cola on sale. I use the example of a sweater in the book. There's $100 sweater that's been marked down to $60, right? In that case, that one item has created two things to compare: a $100 sweater and a $60 sweater. And compared to that $100 sweater, the $60 sweater seems like a great deal. Because if you just were to walk up to a sweater and look at it, how would you have any sense of what you should pay for? Like, how do you judge? Is it how long it's going to last? Is it how warm? Is it how cool I'm going to look in it? So you've created these two different items to compare them to. And relativity is looking at the relative value. It comes up in a lot of senses. The most common is in sales, right? People always ask me, particularly now when recording this after the holidays, like, what about sales? Like, isn't it always great to get stuff on sale? Well, no, it shouldn't matter if it's on sale. You're never saving that $40, right? That $100 sweater doesn't exist. What you should be thinking about is, should I spend $60 on it? But because we're caught up in relativity and we think about like how much we are not spending instead of how much we are spending, that tricks us and takes us further away from really considering those opportunity costs. Another way it comes up is often in percentages. Right? Like, we'll ask if you are at a store and you're buying like a stack of printer paper and it costs $15, and the clerk tells you that down the street is another store that they can sell the same thing for $5. Most people would walk down the street to save $10. But if you're in a furniture store and you're buying a sofa for $1,015 and the clerk says down the street it's available for $1,005, most of us would not walk down the street to save that $10 because that doesn't seem like a big deal. When essentially the question is the same thing: would you walk down the street for $10? But we get caught up in this relativity and we think, oh, well, it's just, a tiny little percentage of a big thing, when really money is that $10 is $10 no matter whether it comes out of 1,000 or it comes out of 15. The example that I think about a lot, maybe this time in my life or my neighbors, is about home renovation. Like, I live on a street, a lot of people are always doing work on their houses. It's annoying. But people spend $200,000, let's say, on a home renovation, and they'll have a contractor come up to them at some point in the process and say, hey, for an extra $20,000, I can get you something Italian, right? You don't know what it is, and you're like, sure, what's the big deal? It's a drop in the bucket. The same people will go to the grocery store and they'll spend 10 minutes every day trying to decide if they should get the organic tomatoes that cost 10 cents more than the regular tomatoes. Right? A lifetime of buying tomatoes is not going to make up for that $20,000. But because it's like a bigger percent and because it seems like a relatively not a big deal, we don't think about it. And, that's another thing to touch on. Another topic. A challenge is often the big expenditures are the ones where we don't spend a lot of time thinking about, and little ones are the ones where we obsess. And, Dan and I say and tell people, like, don't obsess over the 10 cents on the organic tomatoes or the extra little dollar on your $5 coffee. Obsess over the $1 million home or the $30,000 car. Like, do think about the big ones. And human nature tends to go the other way because those big expenditures are hard to wrap our head. Like, what's something Italian, right? How do you value that? We tend to make those decisions more quickly and more rationally.
Yeah, and we'll come to that because you do a beautiful job of talking about language and the importance of language as well later on. But you touched on something there, and it's the sales point. And you give a great analogy of Aunt Susan. I'm doing air quotes here. Aunt Susan and the J.C. Penney CEO, Ron Johnson, losing his job over clearing up pricing. I'd love if you share that, because this shows how we fall for these tricks all the time. Right.
So, a lot of these biases are about emotion. How emotion comes into play for us when we're spending money or thinking about saving money. And oftentimes we don't acknowledge that emotion does play a big role, but we should. And in particular, you saw it in the story of JCPenney. JCPenney is this retailer that sells typically clothes. And they used to have a policy where they would always have high prices, but have tons of different types of sales. You could cut out coupons from your magazine or the newspaper. You could go and hunt or buy 2 for 1. And it almost became a game. Like, everything that was on sale, there was no price that was just a price. Everything in JCPenney had a sale price, and people loved it. And this new CEO was hired because JCPenney wasn't doing well. And the CEO's name was Ron Johnson. And he came in and said, you know what, like, instead of treating our customers, like, they're toddlers, and giving them this game. Let's just be honest. Let's give them what we called fair and square pricing. And the fair and square pricing was just the listing the price where it would have ended up after all the sales, in line with the competitors, instead of inflating it and then cutting it. Just give them the straight price. And he's like, oh, this is just the right thing to do. What ended up happening is the customers revolted. Right? They hated it. They couldn't stand the fact that they weren't getting sales. They thought they were now paying more, or they just didn't like the experience. It wasn't as emotionally satisfying to find that sale and say to themselves, I'm saving $40. So customers left. The company started tanking. They ended up firing Ron Johnson. They put in a new CEO who reinstated all this sales gimmick, and the company's fortunes turned back around. I mean, I don't think they're doing great, but like they bounce back. It seems rational, right? If you ask someone in a moment of calm, do you want to have to hunt and peck for a bunch of sales, or do you want to just know what something costs? We would probably say, just tell us what it costs. Then we get in that moment and, we light up. We have a little dopamine rush when we feel like we've accomplished something. Oh my gosh, I went and I saved $200 today. Well, yeah, you also spent $700, but it's that saving that feels good, right?
Yeah. One of the things you link to this as well is the idea of owning property. So you give the great analogy of Tom and Rachel and selling their house, and the overvaluing we have with things that we've put a lot of time into, or things we own that we're selling on, we overvalue.
Sure. I mean, there's something called the endowment effect, which is basically like when you own something and you become, again, emotionally attached or invested in it, you tend to think it's worth more than anybody else does. And, in some ways it makes sense when you think about selling something. You always want to sell high and a buyer wants to buy low, but it's more than just wanting to like maximize the sale. It's really a sense of what you think the value of something is. I mean, there are experiments where literally someone, like I think it was for a coffee mug, if someone held a coffee mug for 5 minutes, they would require more payment from someone else to sell it than if they just like were told, here, how much would you sell this mug for if it was yours? Just like the act of holding it. And it makes you sort of think about that typical, the drug dealer approach, that old cartoon character who was like, hey, kid, first one's free, right? Get them addicted.
Yeah.
And I love to think about, I get a lot of solicitations for free cable networks like HBO, and I love to think of like an HBO executive like, hey, kid, watch a free month of movies. It's on us, and then you get addicted. Ikea is an international brand, so I'm sure your listeners know Ikea.
Yeah.
And they're typically, a lot of their furniture is stuff that you buy and you build at home. And there are studies showing that like people just value a bookshelf, no matter how poorly made it is and no matter how much it falls apart. If they've made it themselves, they value it more than something that didn't make themselves. And it's fascinating. And it again affects like our ability to value something. In the home sales, like a lot of times people like get a home and they have their personal touches and they put around, right, like their pictures of their family, and then they try to sell it. And when they are selling it, they think about all the amazing things that have happened. Oh, this is where, little Joey had his first steps. And over here is, where, Samantha like learned to ride a bike, and like that has all that emotional impact like put into the value of it for them. But somebody walking into an open house doesn't see that. They see, oh, like they haven't cleaned over here, or they see the flaws. And it's important to recognize that in how we approach things, that stuff we have and are connected to, we're of course going to value more than those that don't have those connections.
Yeah, I love that, the IKEA effect, you call it, where you get attached to, you build this chair and it takes ages and you've a load of spare pieces left over, but because you put all the time and effort in. You talk about as well loss aversion, and the endowment effect is really deeply connected with loss aversion.
Yeah, absolutely. And loss aversion, for those that don't know, is the idea that we feel the pain of a loss more than the equal pleasure we get from a gain. If you lose $10, you'd have to gain $20 to sort of even out that feeling. And what that makes us do is like we are very like more inclined to try to avoid losses than we are to pursue gains. This comes out a lot. People who talk to those that invest in stocks and in the market, we tend to make decisions when we're investing that are about not having losses as opposed to perhaps pursuing gains, because we feel that more strongly. Even in something outside of the financial world, when it comes to weight loss, People that are trying to lose weight, when they gain weight, which is in this case the reverse, it's when they're gaining weight is actually a loss in this case. But when they do poorly, let's put it that way, they feel worse than when they do well, and they're more likely to give up on days that they do poorly because of that stronger emotional pull. So when it comes to finances, we tend to be making decisions that are more about not losing money. And again, like I said, the endowment effect sort of works with that. Like on the one hand, we feel that this house has more value than others do, and then we're less willing to give it up because we're going to lose that value. And they work together to heighten that gap between how we would value something and how a potential purchaser were in the case of a home sale.
And you talk about this. This is a nice segue for language, because you talk about this where marketers use this to their advantage the whole time. For example, a burger is 95% fat free, not 5% fat. It'd be great if you talk us a little bit through that.
Yeah, well, it's oftentimes about framing things. My personal bugaboo when it comes to language right now is the word artisanal. I feel like everything is artisanal. I don't know if that's happening around the world or it's just an American phenomenon, but
craft as well. Craft is everywhere.
So same thing. It's another word for artisanal. I'm surprised it's not craft, artisanal, handmade. There are a few things that play with language. One is that I think sometimes a long description, it gives us that endowment effect because we sort of feel like we've spent a lot of time, we've invested a lot of sunk costs into listening to the description or something. But it also makes us think that more effort has gone into something, right? Something artisanal suggests that there's been effort made to create this item. A hamburger that's described by the positive attributes of it and how long it was cooked and where all the ingredients came from and the story behind Bessie the cow, like that makes us think that more effort has gone into creating that. And the reason why that matters is because, again, when we can't value what something's worth, we often rely upon guessing how much effort it went into it, like how much time someone took to create this thing, and that will be how we'll assess the value. There are studies showing if a locksmith comes to open up your door, people are more likely to pay or they pay more to the locksmith that takes an hour and fumbles around and breaks things and goes back and forth to his or her truck than the locksmith that opens it up in 1 minute. Right? Even though the question should be, how much is it worth for me to get in my house, not how long did that person take? The same with like data recovery on a computer. If you want to bring your computer to someone who gets wiped out, if they fix it in an hour, you're going to want to pay them less than if they take a week to fix it. Just because like the only way we can assess that value is by what we think is the effort. And, it's a little silly when you really stop to think about it. But that's what happens. And that's, another way we go away from the opportunity cost is we think about the effort, and language is a great way to convey that effort. When you start talking about all of the, work that goes into something. I mean, go to expensive restaurants and, half of the cost is him hiring a writer to do the menu and add all this flowery language. So those are a couple things that language does. Language is, I even outside of behavioral science, it's very powerful, and it can play on your emotions, and it can just sort of it'll often take you where it wants you to go. I think I mentioned earlier, one of the things that attracted me to behavioral science when I got into it is it sort of reconfirmed some of the assumptions I had, and it provided scientific backing to it. And the studies that have been done about language have really proven that to be the case. And the 95% fat-free instead of 5% fat is another example. Like language tends to focus on the positive attributes of something rather than the negative attributes, because that then makes us feel good about it, and then we're more willing to pay for it.
Yeah, and you touched on this really important point, because you talk about fairness and effort and stuff like the surge pricing from an Uber, or when Coca-Cola were going to hike the price up on warm weather days, for example. It's great if you tell us a little bit about that, because we have a lot of listeners who would own internet companies, and the internet has a really interesting twist in this as well, which will help them guide themselves on pricing, but also the language they use around their product.
When it comes to effort and fairness, and really effort is oftentimes a shorthand for fairness for those of us that are trying to evaluate price, it's the effort that we see. And the only way we could judge effort is if we're aware of it. If we see that locksmith fumbling at things, or we know that the at a recovery person took a week to do it. And one of the challenges is for those industries that, that effort isn't clear. There's not a transparency to the effort. And the internet is a great place. You hire a writer off the internet, speaking personally. How do you have any idea how long it took them? And you don't. You think about Google, right? In Google, you go and search for something and you enter a term and you press a button, and within like a second, they return 400,000 results. Right? Now, that seems like it took no effort at all because it's hard to really understand what goes into that. Now, many companies and other industries understand that in order to like trigger this bias of ours, in order to sort of convey that effort, whether it's, the right way or not for people to assess value, but whether to trigger that requires showing the effort, requires some transparency. Kayak, I think it's an international brand, but it's a website for searching for airfare and travel items. You enter your destination, your dates, and then they sort of go through a process where they show you all, they spin through and you see like 1,000 airlines listed and they slowly eliminate them, and it takes a minute. There's a progress bar. Progress bars are a big innovation. Yeah. So essentially they try to show you all the things they're doing, all the effort they're making, and you value that. There's a website that was showing you not just, it was a dating website, and it wouldn't just show you, your 20 ideal matches. It would also show you the 100 people that you didn't match with to show how much effort was made. The city of Boston in Massachusetts here in America, it's a big city. In the winter, they get a lot of potholes in their street, and people would see, 3 potholes on their street, call them up and say, come fix these. And they wouldn't fix them for, weeks, and they would complain. So the city of Boston created a website where people could see all the thousands of potholes in the city and see that every day, 25 of them were getting fixed. And it showed the effort. And even if the 3 on their street weren't getting fixed, suddenly they valued their tax dollars and they valued their government's effort a little bit higher. So finding a way to show that effort can really make a difference. Now, people could, manipulate that. They could sort of either show the true effort, or they could do things like I always sort of pick on consulting firms because I know a lot of people that work in consulting, and we think about, and we use this example in the book, you hire a consulting firm to do a project, and at the end of the project, they present, a 200 slide PowerPoint presentation, and the first 100 slides are about like what meal they had on the flight out there. And, all you care about is the last slide, like the advice, which is usually like fire a third of your company. But they go through this whole thing because it shows, oh my gosh, so much effort. And then they charge, 100, 200, whatever, a ton of money, thousands of dollars. Because it looks like a lot of effort. For the startups, as you mentioned out there, finding a way to sort of convey the value of what they do is important. There are a lot of ways to do it, and that's probably a topic for another podcast. Explaining to people whether it's like marketing, the value is you get higher notoriety and you're going to sell more of your widgets, whatever. But one way is to show sort of what goes into creating this. Sometimes it's about the effort to do a particular task or project, and sometimes it's about the knowledge. The final sort of thought for now on this, this comes from also my place as like a writer and speaker and person who I've sort of conveyed all this knowledge. And it's, maybe a task doesn't take me, 2 years, it takes me a week to do, but it's based upon what I've learned. The story that resonated for me, and that's also in the book, is about this legend that Pablo Picasso was sitting in a park, and a woman came up to him and said, "Oh my gosh, you're Pablo Picasso. Would you paint my portrait?" And I don't do a very good Pablo Picasso, but let's assume Pablo Picasso said, "Sure, I'll paint your portrait." This is terrible, but I'm going to stick with it.
I didn't know he's from India, man. Is he from India?
No, this is like Italian. And he's not from. It doesn't matter. I've made this choice, and I'm stuck with it.
Go with it, man.
Sure, I'll paint your portrait, and then I'll make a pizza for you. This is very terribly offensive, so I'm obviously not going to get any calls from Italy or India or any other country.
No.
He says, "Sure, I'll do your portrait." The woman says, "Oh, thank you so much." And Pablo Picasso looks at the woman for, a minute, thinks about it, and then with a single brush stroke creates a perfect portrait of her, hands it over. And she says, "Oh my gosh, this is amazing. You've captured my essence. And this is everything I feel and everything that I think. And it's so incredible. What do I owe you?" And he says, "Oh, you owe me $5,000. And she says, "What? It only took you like a minute." Like, that's not fair. It took you no effort at all. He says, no. It took me a lifetime plus 1 minute. And there at the end, he became Jackie Mason a little bit, which I think is inappropriate also.
You nailed it, man. And the essence of that story holds true, that people don't
Thank you.
value knowledge that you've
Right.
built up over years. When I read that, I wondered, is it an envy, or is it just because they can't see the effort that was put in?
Despite everything I've learned in my life, I like to still think that people are good at heart. So I will say my belief is that it is not an envy. It's the fact that they just can't value it. Right? Like, I mean, like, think about if you're handed a portrait of yourself made by Pablo Picasso, like, how do you possibly value what that's worth? Like, that could be anything, right? It could be $20 because he's feeling kind that day. It could be, price it millions of dollars, an original Picasso. Like, how do you possibly wrap your head around what's that worth? Same with like data recovery. How do you figure that out? Now, what you should do, and art is a uniquely special thing, but like data, you should think, okay, what's it worth to me to get all this data on my computer back? Like, if I don't get it back, I'd have to, go and recreate it and spend months doing it, so it's worth whatever that is. But again, we just don't do that. And it's a real challenge. It's why, on the flip side, we react so strongly to things that are not fair. Right, like the example of umbrella prices when it's raining. You have a local store that sells umbrellas for $5, but suddenly there's a downpour and they sell them for $10. We think, oh my God, that's totally not fair, because we know that it took no extra effort on their part. It took nothing for them to like suddenly raise it to $10. So it seems unfair. But we can't like do that same assessment on certain things like art or locksmiths. Or even homes and meals and movies, right? It's hard to do that, so we fall onto these other little tricks.
That, for example, right? So let's go back to the startup or the founder who creates a killer product. Let's say it's Apple and the iPad, for example, and the product does not exist in the market. So therefore, where do you price it? And you give the great example of the other phenomenon, which is anchoring.
There's a story of Steve Jobs when he introduced the iPhone. And it basically, like, he does his Steve Jobs thing where he's on stage in his turtleneck and his whole person gets everyone excited about this product that's coming out and this amazing new thing. And you sit there and you watch it. Like, how do you figure out what an iPhone is worth? Like, all of a sudden, it's a phone, but now you can expand it with your fingers and you can pinch with your fingers and you can scroll and look at the internet and all these things. So how do you know what that's worth? And Steve Jobs says it's worth $600. Yay, great! Like, or they told us it should be worth $900, but we're selling it for $600. And not only that, 2 weeks later, they actually said, you know what? We changed our mind. We're going to sell it for $400. So all of a sudden, you've sort of gone back to that relativity, right? You've created 3 different versions of the iPhone: a $900, $600, and $400. So the $400 seems like a bargain. And at the same time, when he first mentions that $900 thing, that anchors in our mind what that price should be. Anchoring is essentially the idea that, sort of the first price that we see for something has a really strong pull. Right? It has an outsized pull, and we sort of connect to that price, and it's hard for us to get far away from it. You go to a car dealership and, they say this car is supposed to be $30,000. Well, it's going to be hard for you to ever to say, well, it should only be $15,000. And you might feel like, oh, if I get it for $27,000, that's a pretty good deal, because you're only getting so far away from that anchor of $30,000. And the thing that I really was struck by that's related to anchoring was the idea that the anchor often doesn't even have to be relevant, if you will. There's this thing called arbitrary coherence, which Dan and some others studied, which basically looked at some products that were hard to price, right? Like an obscure wine, a box of chocolates. And what they did is they said to people, okay, tell us the last 2 numbers on your social security number. So people would have 18 or they'd have 94, right, as their last 2 digits in their number. And so they said those numbers, and then they said, okay, see those numbers now. Would you pay that amount for these products? And if not, what would you pay? And inevitably, people who had high last 2 numbers, who had this randomly assigned number that were high, would pay more for all of these products than those that had low randomly assigned numbers. And the point being, just having a number associated with the product made us then be more drawn to it magnetically, or like an anchor. I think anchor is the perfect term, which is why they use it. And it's, again, it's a real challenge when we go into some situation where we don't have any idea what the price is. The first price we see is dramatically overweight listing prices. There was a study I think we use in the book about like home listing prices in a town called Tucson, Arizona, and even real estate professionals who should know what things are worth, they were affected by the listing price. Right, a higher listing price made them think they should pay more for it, and it just was. It's just a number, and we can have this affect us in so many ways, and marketers, for better or worse, can either take advantage of that or can use it to their benefit, depending on your perspective. For the consumers in us, we should watch that they don't take advantage of us. And for the developers, we should be aware that it's a good tool.
We talked about startups and fintech businesses, etc. A lot of companies like that listen to the show. The internet is making user experience better and better. You talked about Google giving us searches really easily. Amazon, for example, one of their first patents was one-click technology. There's a reason behind all this, because this leads to thoughtless purchasing.
Yeah, absolutely. And what it does is it takes advantage of our aversion to pain. And that's because there is an actual pain that comes when we pay for things. When we pay for things, this stimulates the same region of our brain as physical pain does. And typically, like, pain has an evolutionary purpose, right? It teaches us to pay attention to something. You put your hand on a stove, you should look at your hand and move it off the stove. Or you have a knee that gets broken, you should feel that pain and look at your knee and go get it taken care of. So when it comes to payment, when we feel that pain, when we hand over a $20 bill, like it causes this pain, and we should then stop and be thinking, oh my gosh, what's going on? Should I do this? Is this a good decision? But what ends up happening, and technology particularly plays a role, is that instead of like feeling that pain, we numb ourselves to the pain. We put up sort of walls that prevent us from feeling that pain. Automatic payment, credit cards, now technology, they all make it so we're less aware of that pain. We're less aware of the payment, so therefore we don't really feel the pain of the payment, and therefore we don't stop and think about it. And going back to what we said at the beginning, we don't assess the opportunity costs. There are studies that show when people use credit cards versus cash, they spend more, they tip more, and they're more likely to forget how much they've spent. I often ask people, do you use credit cards? Yes. Does anybody here, have any idea how much money or what their credit card will be at the end of the month? And almost nobody knows, right? It's always a surprise to a certain extent. It's because we're not really aware when we spend money on a credit card, we forget about it. And there's even studies that show that just the thought of credit cards, like putting out paraphernalia, like a MasterCard, a Visa logo, and the machines that do it, even that has the same effect. People will spend more, tip more, and be more likely to forget about it. It's not as strong as if they use it, but it's like we're Pavlovian, and it makes us like fall into this habit. And it's because we don't feel that pain of paying. And technology in fintech, there's great promise in fintech. Ones that applications and developments and little apps that can help people save more, that can help them plan for special trips or retirement. There's great promise, but also a lot of fintech, or the one that's more sort of known, it's designed to help us spend easier. Right? It's promoted as, making your life easier. Amazon has a store where you can just go in and grab stuff off the shelf and walk out, and you don't ever look at the price. It just gets sent to your credit card. Like that. How easy is that? You don't have to wait in line. Yay. Well, then you don't think about the price, and you don't think about whether or not you should do that. The same with things like Apple Pay, and eventually they'll be like, you just blink and it goes to your credit card. All these things make it so that we don't stop and think. We don't feel that payment, so we don't stop to think about whether or not it's a good decision. We don't think about the opportunity costs. So, I always tell people, when you're, thinking about the latest technology and the thing that says how your life is going to be so much easier, before you adopt it, to stop and think, well, is it really easier or is it better? And it tends to be a lot that a lot of the fintech tends to be about spending things more easily, not about spending them more wisely. And that's because what they tend to do is eliminate that pain of paying. Now, I should say, for people developing stuff, that isn't true for all fintech, but the ones that are sort of supported by the big financial interests tend to lean that way.
Absolutely. And it'd be great to touch on some solutions. For example, retirement, something that a lot of us kick the can down the road. And you talk about the marshmallow effect, for example, or the marshmallow test. It'd be great to touch on that. So some of the solutions, because I was really attracted to the book from the problems perspective, because they're the same problems we see in business, in innovation. They're the same biases that we have, and this mental accounting we do all the time, we're totally oblivious to, or maybe we just pretend we just close our eyes to it.
Well, retirement is an important problem, and it uniquely touches on many things that have to do with the psychology of money and behavioral economics. I mean, consider at the beginning I talked about how hard it is to value something, the price of something. I mean, how do you really estimate how much money you should save for retirement? Right? You have to think about how long you're going to live, how long you're going to work, what your standard of living will be then. Are you going to have health problems? Like, what's the market going to do if I invest? All these, it's just so hard to think about it. So we just don't want to think about it. And that leads us then to sort of fall into these other little traps. When it comes to retirement, one of the big things that plays in is self-control. You mentioned the marshmallow test, this famous test where they put a kid in a room with a marshmallow on the plate, and they say, if you wait 10 minutes or whatever the number was, to let's say 10 minutes, we'll give you 2 marshmallows. But if you eat this one marshmallow right now, you don't get it. And the kids, inevitably, they have no self-control. They eat the marshmallow. There's also part of the study that those that actually do wait are proven to later have better decision-making skills. But let's not talk about those freaks that can stop eating one marshmallow. Like, I don't know what their problem is. So that's a classic example of like what self-control is essentially is like we feel that emotion, that we feel connection to now, to the temptation of right now, that one marshmallow. We don't really think about our future selves, our 10 minutes down the road self. I mean, there are tons of studies showing that like the money has a sort of a diminishing value as farther it gets out in the future, right? If you were to say to someone, would you do something for $100 right now, they're more likely to do it than if it's $100 in a week, even though it's the same $100. And it's because we don't have a connection to our future selves. We don't feel, like we're going to get that pleasure and that temptation satisfied the same way a week, a month, 30 years in the future, which is, what retirement is. Some of that is, because we think that our future selves are perfect. All of us, I'll ask people sometimes to raise their hand if they promise themselves in the last week that they were going to go get some exercise. And then I say, keep your hand up if raising your hand is all the exercise you've ever gotten this week. And tends to be honest, because like we think that we're going to be amazing people the next day, right? We go to sleep at night. We're like, tomorrow is the day I do this thing. And we don't do it. But we think we're going to. And it's the same with retirement. We think, on a certain extent, subconsciously or consciously, oh, you know what? I'll save for retirement later. Right now, I need to go on this vacation. Right now, I need to do this thing. So retirement in many ways is about like a lack of self-control, which is about a lack of connection to our future selves. Now, there are a few ways. You're talking about solutions, and our book does have a solution section that our publisher really wanted us to have, and it has really resonated with a lot of people. I'm like you. I'm more interested in like the what's going on and the science behind it, but we do offer solutions, and in general, what we try to do is we try to say, we're not going to tell you should put X percent here and Y percent there. We're not going to try to change human nature. I think that's where a lot of financial literacy fails, is to try to make people have self-control in this case. Instead, we're going to try to create systems and environments that sort of take advantage of our human failings instead of having our human failings be something that's taken advantage of. Right? Put us back in control of our falling for relativity and the pain of paying and our lack of self-control. For retirement, there are tons of studies that show, people that, typically in America, at least, you sign up for your retirement savings when you start a job, like you get something called a 401k, and you basically check a box. How much do you want to put aside every paycheck? And if you put the default option is, yes, I want to save, and I want to save, a high percent, people are more likely to save that high percent than if you put the default option low. And part of that is just because like you don't want to think about it, or you don't want to go through the pain of thinking in this case. So if you have your default option that people save money for retirement, that's one system that we can make as companies and society to make people save more. A little trick that you can do in that same situation is they found that when people call their spouse at that moment of decision, just talking about that and thinking about their future makes them save more money, right? Not that the spouses are definitely, like say, you have to save, but it helps them connect to their future selves. There's even a really cool study where when people interact with a virtual reality version of themselves when they're old, like they take a picture and then a computer creates this, 80-year-old version of themselves, and they have a conversation, that makes them save more.
Wow.
Now that's not like a realistic thing that can be, replicated on a large scale. It's just kind of cool. So, connecting to our future selves has that impact. It doesn't, that does a little bit of changing human nature because we makes us think about ourselves, but it doesn't like just say, have more self-control. No, it recognizes that we don't have self-control. And those, default opt-in options are recognizing that we're going to take the easy way out when we don't understand things. And it's not asking us to give up that one marshmallow, right? It's not asking us every time to not spend $5 on a latte. It's not asking us to, forego this vacation. It's just making it so it's automatically withdrawn for us. Right? Again, it's like that fintech. You can use things and create systems that do good for you and pursue good goals by recognizing these failings and by recognizing human nature. Another one that's sort of similar is people that have trouble with their spending on a regular basis. We tend to look at our checking account as our discretionary spending. Right? You go to the automatic teller machine, you take out some money, you look at the receipt, and you see you have $6,000. You're like, oh, okay, that's what I have. In general, that's how much money I have. Well, if you create two accounts and from your company, you ask people giving your paycheck, hey, put 20% in this other savings account and only 80% in my checking, then you can kind of fool yourself, right? If we stop and think, we know we have this other money, but on that regular, easy basis, we just look at that checking account balance as our discretionary spending, and we kind of trick ourselves. Again, I'm not saying we should change human nature and be totally rational beings, but instead, we should recognize our irrationality and create systems that take advantage of that to pursue goals that we want.
Brilliant. And when you talked about the retirement and that, I didn't know about the study with the virtual reality self. I thought about, there's a definition of hell, and it's an anonymous quote, and it's basically where you meet your future self, the self you could have been, and you see all the choices you made, the bad choices. We haven't touched on half of the brilliant concepts and biases that are covered in this book. Ulysses contracts, for example, ironically all available on Amazon, one click on any country. But one of the things that really resonated and I thought was really important to get across is you're a polymath. It's a real gift to be able to use disciplines across different fields like you have done now in the world of behavioral science, economics, etc. One of the problems I think in the world, and you touch on this, is that people measure everything by its monetary value. And oftentimes in this world where people, you talk about buying the $1 million house over a $500,000 house, for example, maybe buying the $500 house means you have more time to put into your family, you spend more time with your kids. It'd be great to touch on that as a finale.
Sure. It's a big overarching topic. So I would say that one of my goals in this book is that I recognize that we obsess about money a lot. It provides security. It's something that we want, but we don't think about how we think about it. So my hope is that by revealing some of the ways we think about money, it reduces some of the mental energy we spend obsessing about it, and then we can therefore have more mental energy to spend on the things that really do matter. And what often happens, as you're correct to point out, is that because we think about money so much, and money seems to be, this common currency, literally, it's, a common good that can be used for anything. We value things back on a monetary level when we can't value it another way. And, the example that I've used in my life, and I think you're referring to as a polymath, is when I start something new, like I'm starting to write a book or a podcast, or the first times I was on TV, the people in my life that don't understand sort of how a creative field works or how these fields work will say, what did that pay you? And in my own life, I went through stages where like that really offended me. I was like, it's not about money. You don't understand. And gradually I came to this place where I think it's not that they are being mean about it or rude or saying you should make money. It's that they actually don't understand. And the only way that they can try to put it in a context that matters to them, how they can value, is to put a monetary label on it. Now, for instance, my dad is a physicist. I could find a common language that has to do with physics. I don't know what that be. Like I got on TV. Well, what does that pay? Well, don't think about what it pays, Dad. It's as if you got funding for 6 months of lab research. That's something he would understand. But that common language in between is money, because money is so pervasive. So as far as valuing things about money and overvaluing them, I think that's the reason why we do it. It's because many things in life are hard to value, not just financial decisions, but relationships, vacations, experiences. It's often hard, and knowledge, it's hard to value. Money is also sort of a different side of that same six-sided die, I guess. We do tend to over rely on it when money is a feature. We talk about, because money can be so precise and measurable, when something like an iPhone has a monetary value attached to it, like we will latch on to that monetary value as being the one thing we can compare it to, as opposed to like, oh, this iPhone has all these features, and this Google phone has these features, and this other flip phone has these things that otherwise we can't compare. We over rely on money. At the same time, I don't want to be a critic of it. Money, as I said, has provided our culture and society so many great things. I just hope that we can take a deep breath and stop and think about how money plays a role in our lives, so that we can really pursue what is important and what has real value, which is to live as rich a life as possible.
Beautiful, man. That's a lovely way to finish it. And I really highly recommend this book. Jeff Kreisler, co-author of the awesome Dollars and Cents, How We Misthink Money and How to Spend Smarter. It'd be great to know where people can find out more, because I know you do a lot of global keynote speaking.
Sure. My website is the easiest place to start, Jeff Kreisler, KREISLER.com. That's my sort of Twitter and LinkedIn handle too. And I do tour around. Our book is coming out around the world. I'll be doing events all over the place. Have venue and audience hungry to learn about human nature and the choices we make and the reasons why, and I will be there to share it. I'm also going to be editing a new website that's coming out called peoplescience.com, which is about applied behavioral science beyond just in the financial world, but motivating employees and peers and loyalty and all this stuff. And I'm really excited to delve into more about behavioral science and share the possibilities that it offers to everyone in every walk of life around the world.
I'd love to talk to you when the new book comes out, and hopefully you're in Europe and we can do that one in person. Jeff Kreisler, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Aidan.